Well, hi. The Resident Evil series has been a staple of the gaming industry and wider horror genre since its initial installment first flew off the shelves back in 1996. Some consider it the inception of the modern survival horror, whilst it's also been credited with making games more cinematic due to its cutscenes and camera angles. It was partly responsible for the revival of the zombie genre, and a key inspiration behind 28 Days Later, Shaun of the Dead, The Walking Dead, Dead Space, World War Z, and more or less every piece of zombie-related media these past 25 years. George Romero himself noted how it helped to popularize the genre in recent years, and he's the guy who invented zombies, at least as we know them today. The spin-off films alone have grossed over $1 billion, and the games themselves have shifted over 105 million units, which, considering that new AAA titles shift for £60 a piece, is a lot of
money.
So after 3 titles that struck terror into the heart of everyone who played them, a 4th that was so good that everyone lost their mind, a 5th that was more or less decent enough, and a 6th that was Resident Evil 6, Capcom delivered Resident Evil 7, Biohazard, in which you play as Ethan Winters, whose missing, presumed dead wife Mia seems to have sent him a message from beyond the grave, drawing him to an abandoned plantation in rural Louisiana. And I'm not the only one who thinks it's one of the best horror games of all time. It was praised as helping to revitalise the series, which has since seen another 3 major installments gain widespread, sometimes near-universal acclaim, of the kind that the series hasn't seen since 2005. So what exactly did it do to reinvent a series in its 24th entry, and how was it so successful at doing so? Without further ado, let's prepare for some major spoilers, and get into some random thoughts on Resident Evil Biohazard. I wanted to get this out of the way first, because the switch to a first-person perspective has been discussed a lot, but it's certainly still worth mentioning, as it's a core element of what works so well, and a bold move in a series known for its jarring camera angles, and the use of third-person over-the-shoulder shooting. This newfound immersion traps you within Ethan's perspective, and, crucially, within his fragile little body. The game is clearly aware of this, as you yourself become the subject of the violence, which is, particularly with regards to the protagonist, much more gruesomely specific than in, for instance, the remake of Resident Evil 2. Knowing that you can't escape, Biohazard forces you to watch as your eyes are gouged into, your legs sliced off and reattached, and your hands impaled, sliced open, sawn off, stapled back on, bitten, carved into, twice if you failed to learn the first time, and generally brutalized in more ways than I can remember. You suffer so directly, rather than just watching a zombie nibbling at someone's neck, and a lot of the time, it's unavoidable. You can't even peek round corners in the same way, or see that little extra bit of what's behind you, which grants every chase, and every time you step into a new room, a different brand of terror. It truly seems as though it's you, the player, who's being hunted through the baker's various houses, and that at any moment, they might just slip through the screen and find you. That overwhelming inability to break away from the game's central feeling of oh my god, 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 is aided by the departure from the series' more prominent characters, who are sidelined in favour of new, more vulnerable protagonists, which helps to ramp up the game's fear factor, rather than playing as trained and elite special forces, or characters who've made their way through every zombie outbreak and insane boss fight so far without so much as a problem. We are now, well, just a guy. Ethan's plight leaves us out of our depth, and though it may not make a difference to how he shoots or runs, we find ourselves wishing that there was someone around who was even slightly qualified to deal with the situation. Instead, we lack the comforting reassurance of knowing that we're in the safe hands of, for instance, a counter-terrorist agent and bodyguard to the president's daughter, or a member of the prestigious Special Tactics and Rescue Service, also known as STARS. And that's another thing. In this universe, there's a crack team of special forces known as STARS, a terrifying zombie outbreak in Raccoon City, and a near-invincible tyrant who goes by the name of Mr. X, and dresses like a drunken 1940s detective. Campy roots and comedic elements aside, I'll never understand why Capcom feels the need to make everything so silly. And Don't get me wrong, I love the series and the tone that it takes, but it was definitely refreshing and unexpectedly terrifying when Biohazard refused to allow any moments of levity, both intentional and less so, that are often found within the series. There's no escaping the dread that lingers throughout, and the whole experience is removed from the more ridiculous elements of its predecessors. And by ridiculous, I don't mean the virus that makes invincible monstrosities from human beings, but the prominence of the evil multinational conglomerate called the Umbrella Corporation. And on that note, in order to escape those elements of the franchise, Biohazard pioneers, pushing the series in new directions. Instead of what we're used to, that is, the big bad company unleashing a new virus that wreaks unmitigated havoc, Evelyn is presented as your typical ghost child, there are few returning characters or companies, the events and dialogue are much more centered around Ethan, Mia and the villainous Baker family, and there are none of the zombies that are littered throughout the rest of the series. In fact, there are less enemies as a whole, particularly in the early stages, meaning that you can't be sure what, if anything, will be in the next room. This is in great contrast to walking through the hallways of the previous games, knowing that there'll probably be a couple of zombies and 2 or 3 items in each room. All of these elements add their own brand of horror, and combine to create a further discomfort that arises from not knowing the game as you really should at this point in the franchise. This serves to emphasize the horror at the heart of the experience, as we're never sure what it's capable of throwing at us. And that is perhaps the most important part of the rejuvenation of Resident Evil's horror. Biohazard doesn't feel like it's working within a 21-year-old franchise, but instead has us, alongside Ethan, discovering something new, finding a fresh fear rather than playing on those that we've grown accustomed to, and overcome. But it's not just one fear, or one method of sending us into the panic that encapsulates much of the experience of playing the game. We're faced with a bristling bunch of terrifying enemies, moments, and environments, each of which is distinct and delivers its own horrors. Mia turns monster so that you're attacked by, and have to kill, someone you love. Don't worry, that won't be the last we see of her. But Jack's inevitable march and sheer immortality give us little respite as we work to escape the main house, and Marguerite birthing her bug-infested swampland residence is sure to crawl under our skin. And Lucas? Well, Lucas isn't that scary, but he does give us this terrifying escape room that's sure to haunt anyone with coulrophobia for as long as they live, which probably won't be very long at all, given that Lucas is a psychopath and all of his traps are appropriately murderous. And to add to all of this, we have to face the creepy little ghost girl controlling the Bakers, who lives in this dark attic with a bunch of toys and crude crayon drawings, hiding corpses in hidden compartments and generally bringing an element of supernatural horror cinema into the American Deep South setting. Whether you hate spiders, clowns, or existential dread, or the pressure of avoiding Lucas's lethal shenanigans, there is something to give you goosebumps, so nobody gets to the end of the game without feeling at least a little irreversibly disturbed. And that really cuts to the core of what the series, and the genre, should be about. What Resident Evil 7 does through distancing itself from the series as a whole, is actually to more closely align itself with the fear that the game should be striking into players. The reason that the originals are so influential back in the mid to late 90s, infecting almost every piece of horror or gaming media for the next decade or so, is that they managed to take a medium that, in a commercial sense, began with something as crude as computer space in a year as recent, at the time, as 1971, and, weird unintentional comedy aside, made them absolutely blood-curdlingly terrifying. So those are some random thoughts on Resident Evil Biohazard, and why it was so instrumental in reviving a series that seemed a bit dead in the water, arguably since 2005. It's unlike any of those that came beforehand, but also cuts to the core of what the original game set out to do, giving us a slice of that horrific innovation that always stood the series apart from the rest. And that, for me, is why it's one of the greatest horror games in existence, and a strong contender for my favourite in the series. By which I of course mean that trilogy where an outsider in a strange kingdom is hunted by killers for the threat that they pose to a murderous family, featuring a scene in which said outsider is sat at a dinner table with said family, who offer exotic and mysterious meats during a POV shot from the outsider's perspective, sat at one end of the table, and also harbouring the familial lineup of a psychotic patriarch, an elderly figurehead, a supposed ally who only makes things worse, an antagonistic father, and a true villain who remains in the shadows. In each, the outsider is chased through the rural landscapes by an enemy wielding bladed weapons, and the family, who own large amounts of land that make it seem impossible to escape, eat intelligent, linguistically capable creatures, such as humans. Furthermore, each features a swamp and begins with the prospect of finding or celebrating love with a journey to a faraway countryside location. Said trilogy is of course comprised of Biohazard, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Shrek 2. It's a hell of a triple bill. Alright, thanks for watching. I'm really grateful to every one of you who makes it this far through my dumb jokes, so I hereby award you another 10 lazy words. Those of you who have watched my Bioshock videos will now be on 20 lazy words, and will also understand what that actually means. I honestly cannot be bothered to explain it again. Anyway, how many of you guys have played through the Resident Evil series? Or maybe just Biohazard? If you have anything you'd like to say, please do leave a comment below. And if you liked the video, I'd really appreciate a like, or maybe if you checked out my channel for more of the same. And with that, I will end this video, and see you next time.